to create opportunities for all. My honourable friends have already highlighted the things that we need to address in the state education system. Madam Deputy Speaker, ultimately, private schools are businesses who have enjoyed an exemption from paying VAT on their fees. And it is time now to end that exemption. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have 3 private schools in my constituency. I have had meetings with the 2 private schools that wanted to meet with me. I have had discussions with parents from those schools. It is a fallacy that we will have lots of students leaving private schools to go into the state education system. And to reassure the parents that I've spoken to, it has been pointed out, it has been asked of me, whether this government has actually considered the timing of the implementation of the new policy. And I believe that the speech that my right honourable friend gave does confirm that he has given due consideration to that point. Thank you.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it appears to me that there are 2 parts to this. One is ideology and one is practicality. And it's fair play to the Labour government when they came in. They said this is something that they intended to do. They told the public about it. They put it in their manifesto, and I respect them for that. And that's really important when you compare it to the winter fuel side of things. But it's hard to see that it's not an ideological thing when the Education Secretary tweets, and I quote, "Our state schools need teachers more than private schools need embossed stationery. Our children need mental health support more than private schools need new pools. Our students need careers advice more than private schools need astroturfs and pitches." This reeks of prejudice and propagates a class war. And I'm sorry to say that she isn't here to defend that, because I hope actually she's a decent woman, and I'd like to expect that this is something that she would apologise for. Because actually, as I correctly pointed out, this is a manifesto commitment from the Labour Party, and they have a mandate to deliver it. But they also have a mandate to deliver it in a way that takes into account the impact it is going to have. And we've heard both in the responses today and in responses that I've asked to the leader that an impact assessment has been looked at. Well, if they want to champion putting this in place, why not share that information so that everyone can see? The Dixie Grammar School in my constituency, one of the private schools that's going to be affected, has simply asked, why can't we see what the impact will be? That doesn't seem an unreasonable question. But the second part is something that I raised to the Secretary of State, where the Minister, excuse my mistake, earlier, was at the heart of this is the children. And I do not see the rush to put this in January. The Prime Minister put his child in an apartment because he was worried about the impact it would have on his education for his children. I respect that. So can he not see the problem of implementing exactly the same kind of policy and impact by tearing kids out of schools, which, mark my words, it will happen, and that's what the 2 schools in my constituency have said, to their education? Where is that in a report? And as been mentioned here, the biggest problem I'm going to have in my constituency is that we don't have the places for people who move out of those schools. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what happens then? We haven't heard yet from this government how they'll deal with that. And that, for me, is the fundamental, because how are children and families going to cope with that? The Prime Minister insulated his child. How's the government going to insulate the children of the nation?
Thank you. David Baines.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this debate, and I'm delighted to be able to take part in it, because I'm always grateful for the opportunity to praise and defend our public services and children, and our state schools in particular, and the millions of people, including the vast majority in my constituency and across the country, who rely on them. The opposition motion states its regret that the government has decided to impose VAT on independent schools. Well, I regret that the last Tory government did all it could to deliberately and carefully dismantle, defund and destroy our public services for 14 years, including state schools. There's a huge amount that I could say, and we're pushed for time. Obviously, there's a lot of people who want to speak on this, lots from the government side. I know there's more of us here than there are on the opposition side. Every day, indeed. And there's a lot that deserves to be said about our schools. We've heard a lot from the opposition benches about impact. What's the impact? Suddenly they care about the impact of decisions made in this place. Where was the talk of impact in the last 14 years to cuts to state school funding since 2010? The fact that in St Helens North, 81% of schools in St Helens North have had real terms cuts to their funding since 2010. Over £3 million funding in real terms. £239 for every pupil in my constituency. Where was the consideration for impact when the last government cancelled Labour's Building Schools for the Future programme and watched our state schools crumble? Where was the talk of impact when the last government presided over a SEND system which is failing over 1 million children and which their own education secretary described as lose, lose, lose? Where's the concern for impact when standards fell, which they did? Where's the concern of impact when... No, I will not give way because I'm pushed for time. Where was the consideration of impact when the inspection system didn't and doesn't work for parents, schools or pupils? Where's the consideration of impact when child poverty increased? Where's the consideration of impact when the lack of investment in school support staff and basic resources meant teachers are buying their own resources for their own pupils? Where's the consideration of impact when we've got a recruitment and retention crisis among the teachers? We could talk about all this. If we want to debate on schools, we can talk about all this, but the Conservatives don't want to. They could have used that opposition day debate today to talk about these things. Instead, they've used the time to talk about our decision to end a tax exemption which only benefits the wealthiest. They've shown no concern whatsoever for state schools in the last 14 years, but now they're apparently concerned about impact. Let me make one thing very crystal clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. The parents of state school pupils are every bit as ambitious, loving and hard-working as those who can afford to send their children to private schools. I stand with them and I stand with our state schools.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Others have today talked about the effect on children of military families, those with special educational needs, the effects on social groups and friendships for the children, their mental well-being, the jobs in the state schools and the private schools and the bursaries. But I want to focus my short period of time on those students in exam years, and I should declare an interest as I do have 3 children at private school, one of whom is in her final year. Bringing this measure in is wrong, but bringing it into those in exam years is particularly reckless. We've heard a lot about the Prime Minister and the steps that he took to make sure that his son could study peacefully, to give him the best chance of his GCSEs. Why does he not want that for all the other children in the country? It's not just disruptive, it's actually potentially impossible. Local to my constituency, Stamford School, private school, offers Russian A-levels. Lincoln Minster offers Chinese A-level. Oakham offers the International Baccalaureate. How do these children move into a state school if the school course they're currently studying is not offered? And even if those core courses are offered, the timetable may not work. And even if they do work, they may not be studying the same periods and texts. For example, a student at Nottingham Girls High studying for a history course, the Russian Revolution, as part of the AQA curriculum, may be able to have to move partway through the year to Branston Academy, where they're studying the Tudors on the OCR curriculum, as an example. So what do their children in these courses do? Should they change course merely months or even weeks before their exams? Should they try and learn it themselves? Should they resit a whole year of school? Will the government provide state schools with the extra resources to help these children complete their courses? If they do intend to do so, do they have these resources available to the state schools these children are going to be forced into, ready and available for January? I also want to briefly talk about bursaries. I went to a state primary school and I went to a state secondary school. When I was a teenager hiking with my parents in the North York Moors, I met a young lad who told me all about the very cool, exciting school that he went to, where they did a lot of outdoor stuff. And I was like, well, I'd like to go there, that'd be really cool. My parents said, that's far too expensive, Caroline, we can't do it. And I read about the scholarships they offered, and I was very, very proud and pleased that Gordonson School offered me the opportunity to study for sixth form there, something for which I will always be intensely grateful. But the measures that this government are taking today will reduce the amount of bursary support available for students like me and those who are currently studying at school on bursaries to be able to get the education that they would wish to see. schools are going to have to cut back, and it's the most obvious place to cut back is on the charitable work, the extra teaching staff they offer to people in the state schools, the facilities they make freely available to state schools. This is a short-sighted measure focused entirely on the politics of envy and division.
Laura Kirksmith.
Speaker. Last week I met with a group of incredibly dedicated and determined women in my constituency, all of whom have children with special educational needs. We discussed the broken SEND system and we discussed what it will take to fix it. I'd like to share their 3 top points. First, they said that when they chase for an assessment or a diagnosis or a school place, they are made to feel like they and their children are a problem, when all they are doing is trying to ensure that their children get the same support and acceptance as any other child. One lady said she was treated like a criminal. This mentality towards SEND children and their parents has to change. Second, they want their children to be able to go to their local state school in their community, but they feel that schools have very limited understanding of their children's complex needs, let alone an ability to manage them. One mum told me about her child being excluded from school because complex needs were treated like a behaviour problem. Yet I know that on their side, schools don't have enough staff or the training to cope. Third, these mums are sick and tired of the lack of accountability in the system. Schools aren't being held to account for the way they manage and incorporate SEND children into school. Local authorities aren't being held to account for their services. Home-to-school transport providers aren't being held to account for how they look after the children. The fact is that the support system for children with special educational needs and disabilities is broken. The answer lies in both funding and in reform of the system, and we do have to make tough choices on where to find this funding, tough choices which the previous government ducked. Rather than political point scoring, we owe it to all these SEND children and to their parents, carers and teachers to work together and do everything in our power to fix this system as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. Andrew Snowden.
Deputy Speaker. It's quite clear listening to the contributions from members around the House that this is clearly ideology over reality. It is economically illiterate. There are new consequences and implications being discovered, it appears, by the minute. And every problem that members opposite say they perceive in the state system, this policy will make worse. They keep saying they need to find more money. They need to fill these magical black holes that they've found. Yet they keep finding billions for pet projects every week in the headlines in the press. And I recently was asked to go to a public meeting with concerned parents in my constituency, and over 100 of them were there, and listening to their stories, their circumstances, it was clear from that evening alone, before we even got to this debate, that this is an ill-conceived disaster waiting to happen. 1,800 children in Fylde are in independent schools, and hundreds of those are with the SEND provision. The schools themselves are major employers and have been at the heart of local communities for generations, whether it's AKS Lytham, whether it's Kirkham Grammar, or many of the smaller specialist independent schools. The parents of the children at these schools are often not rich. They scrimp and scrape, they take on extra jobs, they miss holidays, they don't buy new cars, because they have made personal decisions on their children's education, a right every parent should have, and not face the tax on the education of their children. The idea that they are all just rich and can take this hit, the idea that the schools spend 20% of their income on embossed stationery and swimming pools is simply nonsense. It is fighting the class wars of the past with the future of the children of today. Lancashire County Council have already said they cannot get close to meeting the forecasted increases in places needed. And this is before we get even to the most acute in the SEND provision. This tax on education will not just hit independent schools, some of which are already facing closure, but it will hurt the state sector more. I say this as someone who was proudly educated at a state school, but this is clearly the politics of envy done badly. So much for the supposed grown-ups back in charge.
Daniel Francis.
And for the record, my wife is a Senko in a local authority school, and one of our children is in receipt of an EHCP. I've seen first-hand as a council and parent the decisions local state schools have had to make to cut their budgets. Teachers and staff have to subsidise classroom equipment, cuts to the curriculum, decisions to mix year groups in order to reduce teacher numbers, and with the impact falling on the children in my constituency educated in the state sector. And members opposite would be better to spend their time understanding the real issues on the front line and the impact the decisions that they've made over the last 14 years have had on my constituents in Bexley and Crayford. Ofsted's area SEND inspection of our Bexley Local Authority Partnership last December found widespread and systemic failings leading to significant concerns about the experience and outcomes of children and young people with SEND. And they concluded, overall, the voices of children and young people are not heard well in Bexley. The task of fixing this now lies with Bexley's local area SEND inspection partnership with a range of partners, including our schools. And at the same time, due to the pressures within our schools, Bexley's Conservative Control Council found that the only way to stave off bankruptcy due to its significant high needs block overspend was to agree a safety valve agreement with the previous government. And in a report to Bexley Schools Forum last week, it was outlined it will undoubtedly be very challenging to succeed in both delivering the mitigations already envisaged in the safety valve agreement, the impact of which is assumed to accelerate in the 25-26 financial year, and also in identifying further realistic cost reductions to deal with the current level of overspend. And that the deficit at the end of this financial year is expected to exceed the safety valve assumptions by £1.798 million. While this unholy mess has been unravelling, impacting on the most vulnerable children in my constituency, I was shocked to see a return published in the Election Commission's register. One independent school in my neighbouring constituency, but within my local authority area, made a financial donation to a local Conservative association.
That's a cutback.
I'm afraid this sums up the sorry state of where we are. While the members opposite presided over 14 years in government, delivering a position where teachers and PTAs are funding basic provision in our state school, an independent school clearly doesn't find itself in that same position. It was able to donate part of its profits to the local Conservative association. I was clear in my election 3 months ago, I would support the policy to introduce VAT on private schools. That's the mandate given to me across Bexley and Crayford, and for the reasons outlined, I'll be opposing the motion today and supporting the government.
Peter Fortune.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I should say that my children have been educated in both the state and independent sectors. I spoke earlier in the Westminster Hall debate about how Labour's plan to impose VAT on independent schools is a tax on aspiration. But it's also something else, a lack of understanding of how to govern. Because the government's education tax isn't just a lousy decision, it's a lousy plan. As has already been said, imposing the VAT in January, the middle of the school year, risks disrupting children's education and forcing mainstream schools to accept mid-year students. It denies parents time to prepare and doesn't allow independent schools time to register for VAT. Families of over 5,000 pupils studying at independent schools in the London Borough of Bromley and my constituency of Bromley and Biggin Hill must find up to £4,345 more per year to protect their children's education, or take the brutal decision to remove their child from their friends, the school they enjoy, even at crucial moments like GCSE and A-level year. Is this really what the government wants? As one concerned parent told me, their children will be 2 terms away from their GCSEs and A-levels, and finding a local state school with the capacity to take them on that is studying exactly the same exam boards would be impossible. Yep. In truth, the government has no idea how many might leave. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, which the government relies on, estimated that up to 40,000 people would leave independent schools. However, it admits there is too little evidence to be sure, and that the situation is uncertain. The Independent Schools Council estimated in 2018 that if VAT was imposed, pupil numbers would drop by over 134,000 over 5 years. Whatever the number, it's a safe bet that this will be a slow burner, with some pupils forced out immediately and others leading after exams, and others never enrolling, resulting in years of uncertainty for schools, their staff, students and teachers, as many smaller schools simply wither. Even moderate numbers of exits threaten to close small independent schools. The likely result will be fewer pupils, fewer schools, and more significant pressure on mainstream schools. This is a reckless recipe that will disrupt the education of pupils with special educational needs, pitch parents against councils and burden mainstream schools. When the Labour Party said that it wouldn't tax working people, we had no idea that their targets were children and pensioners. It's ideological, not practical, and it will impact far more pupils than the government will admit or recognise. So let's be clear. In a few short weeks, when children up and down the country will be saying goodbye to their friends, when they'll be struggling with the anxiety of being forced to a strange new school, and through no fault of their own, suffering academic pressure in an exam year, this will be the result of government policy. As one head teacher said to me, this policy is nothing short of cruel.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am new to this place. Indeed, up until the 4th of July, I was teaching in an independent school. Indeed. And I've got to tell members opposite, the repeated accusations that this is a policy of spite, that this is an ideological attack, that this is envy, it's cruel and vindictive. I have friends and former colleagues who are right now teaching in the independent sector. In fact, we're 10 minutes into period 6 as I speak. It is nothing of the sort. This is about fairness. When you are a private business, you pay VAT. We believe in paying your taxes. The member opposite makes the point about charities. I'll say the same thing to him as I said to my former boss. Charging somebody £15,000 a year for an education is not a charitable act. And it is interesting to note, the member opposite was briefly the candidate in my constituency. Given the result, it's rather a shame that he didn't continue to be so. I make the point. The opposition today, as I understand it, could have brought a motion about anything. They could have brought a motion about the crisis facing children in social care, slowly bankrupting local authorities like mine. They could have brought a motion today about child poverty that results in 1,500 Hartlepool children not having a bed to sleep in tonight. Yep. They could have talked about the scandal of children arriving at school hungry, the 10% cut to our FE sector, the third drop in our apprenticeships, the school cuts that have cost Hartlepool schools £1.7 million in real terms since 2010. But no, they chose to talk about this. The removal of a subsidy that the 93% pay for the 7% who want to send their children to private school. It is wrong. And the myths attached to it, ridiculous. And I don't have the time to go into the many things I would like to say, but I want to finish on one simple point. I am sick and tired of listening to people talking about parents of aspiration and who work hard being only those who want to send their children to private school. All parents aspire for their children. All parents work hard for their children, and we stand up for all parents and all children in this country.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow the member for Hartlepool. I would just mention that I am the child of aspirational parents from a working class background. And there were 3 little words uttered by Tony Blair which gave a lot of my family faith that an incoming Labour government would be a good government. It was education, education, education. But now those same people tell me that they're disappointed in a Labour government which is going to tax education. And just to be clear, the charitable education is not about the children in the school, it's about the children who are not at the school. It's about opening up the facilities, which I'm sure he knows, to the community, about serving the community. That's where the charitable status comes from. And I know that because my child was one of the 7% who I sent to an independent school. But what he says about the allegations of vindictiveness and ideologically driven policies, they're not coming from the opposition benches. They're coming from the hundreds of emails we are getting from our constituents. Our constituents worried about how they're going to get their child into a state school, and the parents of children at state schools who are worried what's going to happen to the resources at their school when it has to cope with the influx of children from the independent sector. Edinburgh has 20 to 30% every year of children in the independent sector. Figures produced by the Labour-led council just before the general election showed that by the end of this decade, 16 schools will be over capacity without any influx from the independent sector. We have problems in education, but this is not the solution to it. It's especially not the solution in Scotland, and I'm not going to preach to you about English education, but it's especially not the solution in Scotland. We have had 17 years of damage and mismanagement to our state sector in Scotland from the SNP. And to parents in Scotland now, it just feels like the Labour Party is joining in. Because one of the big flaws is that while the Minister said earlier the money will go back into education, parents in Scotland would like to ask, how? There is no mechanism. It's a reserve tax, education is devolved. And even if you could come to some agreement with the SNP, how are you going to ensure that the places for the 9,000 children in Edinburgh in independent schools are available in their catchment area? How are you going to make sure they're the right subjects? And how are you going to do it by January? 5 months. 5 months. And you're going to disrupt children's education. I've listened to lots of people here today say that every child's education is important. Yes, it is. Every parent is aspirational for their child. Yes, they are. And every child deserves not to have their education disrupted with 5 months to find a solution. That's not fair.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to speak in this debate. I find it absolutely incredible that after 14 years of an abysmal record on education, that the party opposite want to have a debate on education. But somehow, I'm not surprised. I've often joked that the party opposite would blame teachers for the sinking of the Titanic if they got the opportunity. Although recently I was told they did, apparently. As a former teacher, I saw the abysmal record of the Conservative government on education firsthand. In fact, I'm standing here in this House because of it. When the former member of Surrey Heath declared that the majority of teachers were letting down the children that they teach, I saw red. And I knew that only those people that donned the red rosette could fix the mess created by 14 years of ideological cuts. Between 2010 and 2020, spending cuts per pupil in England fell by 9% in real terms. 1 in 8 schools were in deficit by the end of 2023, and 2 out of 3 local authorities are struggling to find funding for SEND in their schools. In 2022, the number of trainee teachers who failed to qualify, who left because of the unmanageable high workload, was 40%. And having recently spoken to several teachers in Essex, I know the profound impact that 14 years of Tory mismanagement has had on their mental health. But it's worse than that. In 2012, Essex County Council first raised the issue of RAC in our schools to the government, and the government said there was no money to fix it. Now, in 2024, the failure to properly tackle this issue has been borne out. Last week, I visited Durand Primary School, one of the many brilliant primary schools in Harlow, who are currently unable to provide hot food to their children because their kitchen is still closed because of RAC. SFG school in Harlow cost £29 million to build, and because of the failure of the last government is having to be pulled down. Madam Deputy Speaker, the education system is broken, and it is broken by Tory design. Labour has a plan to fix the education system, but it requires difficult decisions. Removing the tax deduction on private schools is not the politics of envy, but it is a necessary action which will generate between £1.3 and £1.5 billion for the UK government. To invest in our schools, to invest in our teachers, and to provide the people of Harlow, of Essex and across our country the best possible education. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will take no lectures from the party opposite about education.
Simon Hall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, let me reiterate to the Minister I think, the asks which this side of the House has had. Now, in an ideal world, we would prefer not to see this policy go ahead, but the mathematics of this place indicate that whatever the government wishes to do, the government will secure. It should be delayed until September 2025. That allows for sensible planning. Clearly, those who are SEND or children of military people serving or our diplomatic service should also be exempt. And I would also like, on behalf of many of the schools in my constituency who have raised this, whether VAT is going to be applicable on things like summer schools and other events which they put on. Bryanston School in my constituency has a fantastic relationship with Blandford High School. I have, unlike the Treasury Minister who opened the debate, I have no skin in this game. I was not privately educated, nor are my 3 children. But North Dorset is not a particularly wealthy constituency. 792 jobs are linked to Bryanston School. The soft power that the schools provide in an international environment also, I believe, need to be taken into account. They make a contribution, Bryanston School alone makes a contribution of £24 million a year to the local North Dorset economy. Now, my asks, I have to say to the Minister, are actually quite small in comparison to the ask that my Labour opponent would have been making of the government had he won in July. Because when Richard Jones, the head teacher of Bryanston at a church hustings, set out all of the good work that Bryanston does in the community, its contribution to the economy, the jobs that it creates, he said he was fantastically interested to hear this and would table an amendment to the legislation to secure an exemption for Bryanston School. So if the Labour front bench couldn't even convince their own Labour parliamentary candidate in North Dorset of the merits of this policy, they have signally failed to convince the many parents and others who work very hard to send their children to school in the independent sector. My final words, Madam Deputy Speaker, is I do wish the Secretary of State for Education, that terrible tweet that she put out a couple of days ago, she is Secretary of State for Education for all children, irrespective of which sector they go, and the divisive words that she used where she referred to our children versus theirs. That is the them and us. She has aided the government's case and cause and argument, not a jot. She is the Secretary of State for the education of all children. I wish she'd take her responsibilities a wee bit more seriously.
Darren Paffy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this opportunity to speak about what it means to have a government that will not just talk about opportunity, but will take action to bring opportunity and aspiration and ambitions to not just 7% of the population, but to 100% of our children and young people. And like my honourable friend, I note that the opposition motion expresses the Conservatives' regret over this policy. Well, do they not regret 14 years of underfunding our state schools? Do they not regret slashing opportunity by shutting Sure Start centres, lock, stock and barrel? Do they not regret growing child poverty on their watch? And do they not regret that more on their benches have turned out today to defend tax exemptions than did to defend their record of the NHS last night? The reason I'm proud to stand here today is because this is a government that is putting opportunity and ambition front and centre in our missions. And these principles, that everyone growing up in my constituency of Southampton Itchen should have the opportunity to get the best start in life, to do well, to be ambitious and be supported to pursue their dreams. These are things that are not simply the preserve of children in independent schools rather than state ones. Every parent wants the best for their children, whatever school they choose. And I've had parents who have taken the decision to pay for private education for their children get in touch with very real concerns, and I acknowledge they are not all the super rich, and that not all independent schools are like the Eatons and Harrows of the world. But claims of an exodus from private schools to state schools are, I'm afraid, completely unfounded. They should be listening to the Chief Executive of the Independent Schools Association, representing less prestigious, less expensive schools, who's actually talked about how many might benefit from a trading down, which means more students and more income to their schools. The reality is that, as one of my other colleagues has noted, there have been above-inflation price increases for those schools year on year, and there has been no diminishing of student numbers. One small independent school that many in my constituency go to said they have already made plans. They have planned for business and they will pass on just 4% onto the school fees. So this is not about restricting parents' choice. It's not anti-private school. This is about fairness. And it is a question of priorities, because improving all our state schools to benefit everyone costs money. And that's why we can't justify these tax breaks anymore. So I do wonder, in this tone-deaf motion from the opposition, what they would say to constituents in Southampton, where many schools had to ask for donations, where teachers that they don't think deserved a pay rise have been struggling. What are they going to say to those? We make this with no apology.
Saqib Bhatti.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I just want to say straight from the outset, this is clearly an attack on aspiration, clearly an attack on opportunity. And to the honourable member, what I would say to his constituents, he voted for winter fuel payments to be slashed, and now he's voting for an attack on those hard-working families who will be struggling to make ends meet, because the majority of independent schools, and you know, I went to a state school and I went to an independent school, and I was grateful for both of those journeys and for both of those educations. There will be plenty of families who will be struggling to make ends meet. It's hard-working families. And the first point I wanted to make in this debate really was about tone. And I'll come back to the Education Secretary's tweet, which I did think was deeply offensive. But surely the members opposite must acknowledge, as a simple case of maths, that those people who are rich enough to afford VAT increases, whether it's 4%, 16%, which is the average, or the whole 20%, they will continue to send their kids to these schools and pay those fees. It's the people who are struggling to make ends meet, or the really hard-up families, or, God forbid, those children who are on scholarships and bursaries, who now, those parents now no longer will be able to send their kids to those schools, because those schools will have to withdraw those scholarships and bursaries because they will be less affordable. So the tone of this debate is really, really important. I would just caution to the government to be more cautious on this, because frankly, when they refer to tax breaks, these are not tax breaks. Education should not and is not taxed, and they are now about to open that Pandora's box. There was a lot of comments from the government benches about state schools. I agree. I think state schools, you know, the standards in state schools should be improved. And you know, they talk about the last 14 years. We delivered a real terms increase per pupils. We delivered record funding, about 60 billion. They can challenge that, but it's a pure fact that I'm putting out there. I'm happy to share those as well. We did that, and the result of that, especially our focus on things like phonics, which the government, when they were in opposition, they challenged, meant that we are now have some of the highest reading standards in the world, independent and internationally rated. We have some of the highest ratings in mathematics. So they can try and frame this debate as anything other than ideological. They can try and do so, but those arguments are severely undermined by the Education Secretary's tweet, which is really put it out there that this is really a class war. But the fact of the matter is, and I just want to, I will do.
Was making a great point about how this is ideologically motivated. Can he see why there's a difference between charging VAT on a private school and not charging VAT on something like, say, Kit McGrath tuition, which many of my constituents benefit from, which is also a paid-for form of education, which they've chosen not to tax, at least yet?
Well, I think my honourable friend, and I thought she made an excellent speech about the practicalities of introducing this in January. I think she makes a really excellent point about, the slippery slope of this, because, frankly, they say this is going to be focused on educational improvements, but this money will go into the general pot. There is no guarantee of that. They've promised 6,500 new teachers, which is less than what we delivered, but it's also, by the way, a drop in the ocean, and it will barely make a difference to all the hundreds of thousands of schools that are out there that, of course, need extra teachers. I will concede that point. I think we should have better educational standards. But I also just want to make the point about SEND, because SEND is going to affect every member of Parliament. It affects me. I was with the North Solihull parents group just a few weeks ago. Those parents who are now no longer going to be able to afford to send their children to private education for SEND purposes will now have to rely on the state. That will further exacerbate the state provision. Surely the members opposite can see that if there is greater burden, if they are right and there's a lack of teachers, surely that burden increases. How does this policy, and I'm sure the Minister may address this point, how does this policy improve state school provision? How does it improve the standard and quality of delivery for SEND parents? And look, if it was good enough for the Prime Minister to make a special provision for his kids, and it was good enough for the Education Secretary to have a benefactor, what are these parents going to do?
Josh Fenton-Glynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm proud to have gone to Calder High School in my constituency, which was the first purpose-built comprehensive school in the north of England. And while the history of that school and its teachers are fantastic, the building is not. And after years of underinvestment in the capital programme and the shameful cancelling of building schools for the future, the building is crumbling. The same could be said for Brooksbank and Todmorden High School, also in Calder Valley. And all of those would have been scheduled for a rebuild sooner had the government not cancelled building schools for the future. But it's not just the buildings that are on their knees in the state sector. There is everything inside the buildings too. At the start of the previous government austerity, we heard about teachers going without items or buying them with their own money, whether they were glue sticks or books and so on. Now when I talk to head teachers, they talk about going without teachers and support assistants, so vital for children's needs. We can judge a government or indeed an opposition by their priorities. And frankly, the first time an Opposition Day debate has mentioned education, it is focused on the 7% of students who go to private schools, shows where this opposition's priorities are. If you'd had a debate on SEND, I would have welcomed it, because SEND has been left in crisis. In Calder Valley, I can point to multiple examples of parents for whom advocating for their child has become a second job. And that's just the children that have the resources to do so. Ahead of this debate, I asked head teachers what their priorities would be for education. One who didn't want to be named said to me this: any therapeutic service is no longer easily accessible. No educational psychologists, no speech and language therapists to access for the increasing number of pupils who become unable to access the curriculum. We need to focus on the next generation in state schools, in all schools, and that should be our priority. I know that if I ask my constituents in Calder Valley what they think £1.5 billion would be better spent on, that the tax break gives, it would not be the 7% of children who go to private schools. Thank you.
Jerome Mayhew.
Speaker. Now, I have a child at a private school, and the government benches opposite say that that's not a problem. They say this is not a criticism of private education. They say that this is merely a revenue generation exercise, not social engineering, not socialist class war. So it must be a coincidence, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is a policy that punishes aspiration. It must be a coincidence that this is a policy that pulls children down rather than lifting them up. And it must be a coincidence that it's a policy that is being rushed through, as we've heard time and time again, a socialist red meat policy to placate Labour backbenchers who are having the gradual and terrifying realisation that they may well be single-term members of this place. The government needs to think again. We've heard really serious objections to this policy, not to its implementation, because we know that the mathematics of this place mean that the government has sufficient support behind it to force anything through, however ill-advised. But there are some serious recommendations for review, for improvement, for tweaking, to undo some of the very significant damage which this policy, unamended, will cause. Introduction of the policy on the 1st of January, halfway through the academic year. The damage to children, to children's education, these are real people. 10,000 children have already left the independent sector. Their education and thousands of other people like them, they need to be considered by this government. Children who are sitting public examinations this year, the Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Highcombe made a brilliant point, a really serious point that should not be just cast aside, but should be really considered. What do you do if you are a child studying under one exam board and being transferred in your exam year to another system? What do you do? What is the government's answer to that? Pupils who are applying for EHCPs. I have a school in my constituency, Langley. 34% of their pupils have SEN needs and are treated for them. Only 9 of them have EHCPs. What do those other students do? Surely there should be a delay for pupils who are applying for EHCP. Military families. We've heard from gallant members of this House who have said that decisions are being taken now by military families about their future in the armed services. Specialist schools for music and dance. These are really important for the fabric of our future, for our community in the future and the quality of the life that we have in this country, not offered in the state system.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for the comments he's making. Does this not just make the case further as to why the government should publish its full impact assessment and the impact this will have right across all of our schools and the impact it will have on children right across the country?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, because there is no evidence that the government has published to support the stated objective. There has been no impact assessment. This is rushed, and the price of this rushing is being paid by vulnerable children paying the price for internal Labour politics. Shame on you.
Alan Gemmill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 14 years of Tory neglect have left many of our schools on their knees. And the situation is no better in Scotland. After 17 years of the SNP, Scotland's once world-beating reputation for education has been tarnished. I regularly meet and hear from teachers whose passion and dedication is palpable, including Mrs Boyd and Mrs Mackay, the primary 6 teachers at Struthers Primary School in Troon, 21 of whose pupils have sent me individual letters asking me to join the Fair Trade campaign to be the change. But over a quarter of children in North Ayrshire now live in poverty. That's 6,234 children held back before the school day begins. The party opposite has forgotten about the effects of austerity on constituencies like mine. They and the SNP are both living in their own fantasies. Having squandered reserves through financial incompetence, SNP-run North Ayrshire Council is now facing £12.6 million in cuts in their coming budget. The situation has only been worsened by the council tax freeze imposed by the SNP in Holyrood. The council is now proposing cutting 90 teaching posts between 2025 and 2027, removing a total of 230 hours of pupil support assistance, equivalent to 8 full-time staff, all school crossing patrols, and the equivalent of 1 full-time post from the music service and 1 from the 1 full-time educational psychologist. This will be a travesty for children in North Ayrshire, and it casts further shame on the SNP's education record in Scotland. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that this policy will raise more than £1 billion and see significant additional education spend in England, meaning significant Barnett consequentials in Scotland and for the young people in my constituency. Today's generation of young people deserves no less after suffering year after year of excuses. This government is not prepared to settle for more of the same.
Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Families and schools in the Runnymede and Weybridge constituency are very deeply concerned about this policy. They've contacted me to say that the pressure it's going to put on them, and many have already started applying for school places in the state sector. Our independent schools reckon that it's going to be about 5 to 10% of children that state educate are going to move back into the state sector, with, as we've just heard before, a disproportionate impact on kids with SEND. There's a whole, and in my constituency, it is around 8,000 children, roughly, who are educated in the independent sector. That means a lot of pressure on state schools locally. It means a lot of kids who have special educational needs, where their needs are met by the independent school now applying for EHCPs, which is extra pressure on assessments and extra pressure on provision. And I support all my schools. I'm aspirational for all the children in my constituency. And this policy, if it's enacted, and I expect it will be, is going to cause great harm. Now, I would like the Minister to be able to quote back data to me, to quote back analyses, to be able to quote back stats and go, Ben, you're wrong, don't worry, your silly little head. Yeah, it's all going to be fine, because here's the data to back it up. But he can't, because the data's not there, because they haven't done the analysis, because this is sadly a debate which has been driven by ideology. It's about 1 in 5 children, roughly, who educate their children in independent schools in my patch. And I must declare that I'm also a parent who's chosen independent education. We're really going to suffer from this policy. And I know the Minister, the member for Portsmouth South, is a good man. And I know members across the House who, especially new members who are finding the seats in this place, are starting to think about policies and decisions going forwards. And I would ask them, as I asked the Minister, if you can't see the data and analysis for this, please ask why. Please ask for it. Of course.
To listen to the bench opposite, you'd think there'd been a previous government that had totally trashed the state sector, the amount of fear-mongering you do. I think it's quite obvious.
Yeah.
Well, I thank him for his intervention. As I said, it's schools, both in the independent and state sector in my constituency, who are concerned by this, because of the sudden movement of children into the state sector, where places are going to struggle in the middle of the year. Children who are also studying for their exams, children who've already experienced all this COVID disruption, children who may not have the courses available into the state schools that they move to. And so I would plead with the Minister, please, look at the data, do the analysis, see if this is actually going to make money, or if actually it's going to lose money, see what the impact is going to be on children. And I go back to the consultation document that went out this summer, and these brutal, bitter words. The government understands that moving schools can be challenging. I tell you what, if I was a child going through my GCSEs or A-levels, being forced to move into the state sector because this policy, the analysis of which I can't see because the government hasn't done it or won't publish it, but the government understands. It understands this can be challenging. What I would say to the government, please, can you delay this policy? Can you think again? Can you look at it? Can you try and mitigate the impact? Mitigate the impact on children with special educational needs. Mitigate the impact on armed forces families. Mitigate the impact, disruption during the school years. Please, if you're not going to stop it, at least delay it and do the working out. Thank you.
Paul Wall.
Congratulate the party opposite for calling this debate today for the simple reason that it confirms what many of us already know. They're much more focused on the 7% of private school pupils than they are on the 93% in state education. But given the Tory leadership contest is approaching its exciting climax, it's worth pointing out that state education has got barely a mention in that contest so far. I know it's a minority sport, we expect better. In the last Tory leadership contest, though, Liz Truss spent her time either criticising her own state school or criticising the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton for his time at the £45,000 a year Winchester College. At one point, one of her team said she'll take no lectures in educational standards from an LA-based Goldman Sachs banker who went to a school for the uber elite. Meow, as my immediate predecessor in Rochdale might say. Now, David Cameron famously went to Eton, and indeed it was Michael Gove who attacked the preposterous, he said, preposterous number of his fellow cabinet ministers who'd been to Eton. I'm delighted to say that there are more Labour MPs who went to my own state school, Alder Community School in Rochdale, than went to Eton. My honourable friend, the member for Whitehaven and Workington, and I are both proud of that school tie. Sadly, recent Prime Ministers and even Education Secretaries, I'm sad to say, decided the state sector for which they were responsible were not good enough for themselves. During Partygate, we got used to the Tory party thinking the COVID rules were for other people. One rule for them, another for the rest of us was their approach. I'm sorry, I won't give away, I haven't got much time. One rule for them, another for the rest of us was their approach back then. Now their approach is one school for the rest of them, another for the rest of us, and that's just as toxic a charge. But the real problem is money. There was a 9% fall in spending per pupil between 2010 and 2020. Worst of all, we've had 14 years of no overall growth in spending per pupil in our schools. A squeeze the IFS said, quotes, without precedent in post-war UK history. So back to that Tory leadership contest. Most of the contenders for that poison chalice have claimed that if elected, they'll restore private school tax breaks. The fact that the Tories plan to make another 1.3 billion worth of cuts to the state schools on top of their own record of austerity proves they really haven't learned a thing from that catastrophic defeat of the last election. If they all put an ounce of the passion, the emotion, and yes, the hard cash they put into private schools, into state schools, I think the public might start to listen to them again.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The tragedy of this debate is the vitriolic negativity, when all of us surely could unite, that we want to improve the education of all. And the government could have done something so different. They could have said to the independent sector, you're doing well, chaps. Can you give us a bit of help? Can you work with us? Can you share more of your expertise, your wisdom, your success, your facilities? In particular, can you help with regard to special educational needs, where the independent sector is doing so well, at no cost to the taxpayer? This would have gained, I think, universal enthusiasm and support. And I know as a former governor of an independent school that actually, now we're short of time, I know that that would have been welcomed by the independent sector. Instead, the choice that it's made is going to do the opposite of what it intends. What it's going to do is not raise anything like the funding that it thinks, as almost 100,000 children leave the independent sector, many of whom are from with special educational needs. And so it'll earn almost nothing. The unintended consequences of this, I spoke earlier about this. I've got a parent who's written to me, 2 children with special educational needs at private school. She can't afford the VAT, so they're going to go into the state system. The nearest place is an hour away. So now the local authority is going to pick up the cost from the taxi service of over £20,000 per child. Those are the unintended consequences of the real-world consequence of this choice by this government. And here's the thing. Most shamefully of all, because there is such a lack of capacity in so many areas, so many local authorities, you're going to result in bigger class sizes, which means more pressure on hard-pressured teachers in the state system, when actually what we're trying to do is to ease the pressure. So it's going to damage the education of many, many hundreds of thousands of children, exactly the opposite of what is intended. Minister, I would say to you and your government, you could choose differently. You could pause this policy. You could work with the independent sector and gain, I think, much more universal support. Instead, we've got legal challenges going ahead. And Minister, I would ask you to answer this simple question as I finish. If those legal challenges end up in the European Court of Human Rights and the ECHR rules that this policy is unlawful, will your government comply with that ruling?
Baggy Shanker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Education is the foundation. I've done it again, and I'm sorry, Deputy Speaker. That's the local government background. Education is the foundation upon which we build the future of our country. It opens doors, breaks down barriers and creates opportunity. Yet today, so many of our young people are being left behind by an education system that's struggling to meet their needs. Labour is committed to changing that by driving high and rising standards in all areas of our state schools, ensuring that every child, no matter where they come from, has the same access to excellent education. When the Tories, let's use the word, left office, they also left behind a trail of devastation across our education system. Schools were left crumbling, standards were left falling, and they had the audacity to claim that they maxed out on support for our children. We know that couldn't be further from the truth. Our state schools are in desperate need of investment, and that is why Labour is making the political and tough fiscal choices necessary to prioritise our children's futures. One of the most, yet toughest, significant steps will be to take and put a levy of VAT on private schools and end their business rates exemptions. By doing so, we will generate over £1.3 billion, money that will be reinvested directly into the state education system, benefiting the 93% of children who attend state schools. It's time to put an end to a system that allows a privileged few to enjoy tax breaks while the majority of our children are left with lesser funded schools. And we know that's true. What will this investment achieve? It will recruit and retain thousands more teachers, ensuring that every child has access to quality education that they deserve. We will reform Ofsted, improve our schools and provide early speech and language interventions for our youngest children. Mental health counsellors will be placed in every secondary school because we understand that a child's well-being is as important as their academic success. We will expand careers advice and work experience, giving students the skills and confidence to shape their own futures. We know that this works. We need to look no further than in our own constituency. As leader of the council, I was proud to introduce the Derby Promise. The City of Derby has made a collective...
I am going to call the front bench at 1 minute to 4, which means that the remaining speakers are not all going to get called unless you choose to make 1 minute contributions, which I can't recommend to anyone. So just to alert you, there will be some disappointment. Sam Rushworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I came here today to speak on behalf of children and young people in my Bishop Auckland constituency. I recently spent half a day at an independent school in my constituency where we spoke with the students. I also hosted them here in Parliament. I found them thoughtful and polite and a credit to their parents and the school. And I recognise the role that that school plays in my community. I think it's right that the school retains charitable status that allows the school to claim gift aid on donations and to reinvest surplus revenue without paying tax. And I'm fully committed to that school and to its fundraising efforts. And that's because I want all children in my constituency, whether they attend state schools or fee-paying schools, to have the best opportunities to develop their talents and intellects, no matter their background. And I wish I could say the same of the members opposite, but their actions in government tell a different story. At a recent roundtable with primary school head teachers in my constituency, I heard stories of school dinner debts being £1,000 per school because they're having to feed hungry children, children coming into school with wet uniforms because there's no glass in their windows. One teacher talked of having to support children who had experienced horrific abuse, but they were not getting support through CAMS. And children who arrive at school behind where they should be because of the closure of Sure Start. And isn't the truth this about social mobility, that the party opposite scrapped child trust funds? Sure Start centres were closed down, school playing fields were sold off, the educational maintenance allowance was abolished, apprenticeships are down, youth services have been cut 73% since 2010, and there is a 5-year waiting list for CAMS, and a decade lost because every school budget has less funding per pupil today than it had in 2010. Isn't that the truth? And here's another truth. And they don't like hearing it, but in the past 20 years, private school fees have increased by 55% in the last 20 years. So I checked Hansard to see if we had a debate with them all expressing their concern for the state education sector and the impact of this increase. But it turns out when that increase is to make elite education even more elite, they're silent. And I don't see any reason, in fact, why these schools can't absorb why they can't. I will give way.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He talks about the elite, but doesn't he understand the impact of the policy he's advocating, which is essentially the elite, the rich, will still be able to afford independent education, but those who are making sacrifices to be there will be the ones who fall out, and especially those with special educational needs?
I was coming on to that, and I'd say my final comments that if anybody in an independent school is struggling to cut their cloth accordingly, as the state sector have done, I could introduce them to head teachers in my constituency who have had to do that because of the cuts imposed by the previous government. I would also suggest that independent schools look at social tariffs and that they look at other ways to raise revenue. Because nobody wants to be doing this. And this is my point. This isn't about the politics of envy. This is about the fact that, and the party opposite maybe should consider this, that because they have opposed every measure that we are taking to increase revenue or cut spending, they have opposed so far. And maybe they need to consider that that's why they're on those benches and we're on these benches as we try to fix state education, which is essential for our children.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I joined today's debate as the son of educators. My mum, aunties, uncle, granddad, all teachers, both in the state sector and the private fee-earning sector. So it definitely makes some interesting conversations around the dinner table. I also joined this debate representing both state and fee-paying schools in my constituency in Northampton South, particularly the fantastic Northampton High School, part of the Girls' Day School Trust Network, whose students I met in Parliament recently. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a parliamentary candidate for nearly 2 years, and since my election as the Member of Parliament for Northampton South, I've spoken to countless constituents about our long-standing, well-documented and consulted on plans on driving up standards in our state education. And Madam Deputy Speaker, do you want to know how many of those parents actually are going to move their kids into state school once I've spoken to them? The answer is 0. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right this government focuses on improving educational standards for those children left behind by the Conservatives. They have left a trail of devastation across education, from crumbling schools to a SEND sector in absolute crisis. Their legacy in education is to see them hang their heads in shame. When hard-working teachers, teaching assistants and staff reached out, crying out for help, they didn't listen. When the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies said their proposal will raise £1.3 billion for UK taxpayers, they didn't listen. And over recent years, as my honourable friend has said, when fee-paying schools raised their fees above inflation through their cost of living crisis, leaving families struggling, they didn't listen. But only now, when there's political points to score and when embossed stationery is at risk, finally they wake up. Madam Deputy Speaker, no one in this House wants to see the state education sector fail. I'm sure no one on the opposition benches wants to deprive millions of students in the primary state education sector from the healthy, nutritious breakfast they receive every morning, paid for through this policy. I am certain that everyone on the opposition benches wants to see a dedicated mental health support in every single school, paid for through this policy. I'm almost certain that there are those on the opposition benches who want to vote with their conscience rather than the whip. So I urge members from all parties to vote against this political statement and to support the government that the country chose to break down the barriers for opportunity. It's what your constituents want.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to follow Citizen Smith over there. But we have seen from the large number of contributions today, Madam Deputy Speaker, the importance of this issue and the alarm felt by many members and their constituents about the government's proposal. And I'm sorry to say we've heard a lot of 1970s politics of envy today, whereas we believe in evidence-based decision-making. And as many members have pointed out today, it's becoming increasingly clear that Labour's planned education taxes, removing both VAT and business rate exemptions from independent schools, will not do what they claim it will do. I'll move on to the details in a moment, but may I first of all congratulate those who've delivered their maiden speeches today and thank them all for making gracious comments about their predecessors. And I learnt something about each of them today. The member for North East Derbyshire spoke eloquently and lovingly about her beautiful constituency, as did the member for the Isle of Wight, who brought back many holiday memories for myself. The member for Glasgow East gave us all good advice on naming children in Glasgow. The member for Tipton and Wednesbury may or may not be aware that we share something in common. We were both student union sabbatical officers, though I was a few years earlier than her. And the member for Horsham gave perhaps the most eclectic speech today, mentioning Daleks, potholes and Anne Widdecombe all in one speech. I'm afraid then I'm not going to be so gracious about some other comments we have heard today from the opposition benches, who still do not seem to realise they are now in government and their job is to talk the country up. They have constantly talked not only the country down, but the education system down. Let me remind them that when we left office, educational standards were going up. Per pupil funding was at record levels, in contrast to when they were in office and we were falling the league tables. And what a brass neck compared to their record in Wales. We have been backing our brilliant teachers, and I would hope that they would do the same. Madam Deputy Speaker, the motivations behind this policy are clearly questionable. The impact assessment is currently non-existent and the savings are illusory. And there are so many potential unintended consequences and uncertainties around these proposals that at the very least the government needs to postpone implementation, though it would be better to scrap the plans altogether. And they are also moving away from a long-held principle that we used to agree across this House, that educational services are just not taxed at all. It's a terrible record that they are now bringing in. And we've got 5 key categories of concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, around the impact of state schools, regarding the impact on government finances, the timing of the proposals, consideration of exemptions, and of course the impact on SEND and EHCP. I will not repeat all my comments from the debate we had earlier on, but on a few of these areas it is so clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this policy will not only have a detrimental impact on the independent school sector, it will also negatively impact the state sector, because the imposition of a 20% VAT hike overnight will mean some families will no longer be able to afford the fees, and inevitably this will mean children leaving the private sector and moving to the state system, putting an additional burden on many local state schools, some of whom do not have the capacity. And as I said this morning, this is not fearmongering, this is not scaremongering, this is happening already. We're already seeing it in the schools, and according to some forecasts, instead of the predicted £1.5 billion saving, this is a policy that could actually cost the taxpayer money. And how extraordinary to choose this policy area to try and eke out some cash when there are so many other options available if they were brave enough. And out of total government spending of over £1.2 trillion, is this really the policy they want to prioritise? And on the topic of overall government finances, we have not yet heard clearly, will the Department for Education get more funding from the Treasury if the number of state school pupils exceeds expectations? Or will they be expected to pay it out of existing budgets? Has the government set aside capital for additional new school spaces if it is needed? Regarding the timing of the proposals, many honourable members have mentioned it is beyond belief that the government is bringing this policy in the middle of the school year, when schools are simply not ready for it. It is not fair on the independent sector to expect them to suddenly get their heads around new legislation, register VAT, implement new systems and processes literally in a matter of weeks and before Christmas. That's not going to happen. We have not either, Madam Deputy Speaker, heard about whether they are going to create exemptions or special considerations for all of these areas: military families, students on music and dance schemes, children attending small schools and small language schools, religious schools, or paying low fees or on bursaries, or children in exam years who may have to move to another school that doesn't currently offer their curriculum. And of course, what are they doing about pupils with special educational needs and with an EHCP or on the process of gaining an EHCP? And if, as many predict, there is a displacement of children with SEND and EHCP into the state sector, is there capacity and is there adequate additional funding plans support for local authorities to deal with the predicted increase in demand? I wish to make a couple of other brief points before concluding, Madam Chair. As a Conservative, I believe in choice, and I will not criticise choices made by parents about their children's education. I have no qualms, however, criticising hypocrisy. The irony that I stand here today as a proud product of a state comprehensive education, defending independent schools, while the Government Treasury Minister, who spoke earlier, is a product of a private education and is pursuing a policy that could undermine independent schools, is not lost on me or others. And many members on the government benches themselves attended independent schools or sent or are sending their own children to independent schools, and yet are now determined to increase the costs on others, depriving many families of the choice they themselves had. I'm also glad to see the Secretary of State for Education, who is now in her place after being conspicuously absent. And perhaps she would take the opportunity to apologise for the tweet. Parents who send their children to independent schools, who pay twice for their children's education, deserve better than to be treated with contempt by their government's Education Secretary. The divisive tweet put out by the Education Secretary this weekend was shockingly ill-judged and ill-informed, sneering and smirking about embossed paper and swimming pools. Does the Secretary of State really not understand or recognise that not every independent school is like Eton or Harrow? It betrays incredible lack of awareness and poor knowledge of the facilities and financial status of many independent schools in this country. It demonstrated that this policy is being promoted not on evidence, but on envy and on spite, and ill-informed and misplaced envy at that. Certainly.
I agree entirely with what he has said, but could he add to the indictment of the Secretary of State the fact that she failed signally to realise that she is the Secretary of State for all pupils, whether they are in the independent or the state sector? And the divisive language that she used was a very rude signal of 2 digits to those families who've taken a decision that she doesn't like.
I think my honourable friend put it very well. I don't have to add to his comments. He put it very well. In summary, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a rushed and ill-judged policy that will not raise the money the government assumed it would, that will undermine the viability of many independent schools, put immense pressure on the state school system, and put in jeopardy the education prospects of thousands of students, including many with special needs. We implore the ministers to reconsider.
Stephen Morgan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank the opposition for bringing forward this debate. While the focus today has been on private schools and the implications of the planned tax changes, it allows us to consider what is important in education. It is important to support the aspirations of all young people and their parents, and essential that all young people receive a good education in a safe and supportive environment. It is certainly true that many parents choose to seek this provision in the private sector, and this government will always support their right to choose where to educate their children. But most parents do not have that choice, and all parents have high aspirations for children. We therefore need to prioritise our efforts and consider how we can better serve the 94% of children in our state-funded schools. Madam Deputy Speaker, ending the tax breaks on VAT and business rates for private schools is a necessary decision to drive high and rising standards across our state schools and give every young person the best start in life. It would generate additional funding to help improve public services, including the government's commitments relating to children and young people. Now, this money will allow the government to expand early years childcare for all by opening 3,000 new nurseries, thus helping parents back to work. The government will recruit 6,500 new teachers and improve teacher and head teacher training as part of restoring teaching to the career of choice for very best graduates. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Treasury are, of course, responsible for tax policy and have led on the publication of the draft legislation and technical consultation since July. And as the Exchequer Secretary set out in opening, VAT will apply to tuition and boarding fees charged by private schools for terms starting on or after the 1st of January 2025. It is right that we end tax breaks as soon as possible to raise the funding needed to deliver these educational priorities. The Treasury is assessing the impact of these changes in advance of the budget. The Independent Office for Public Budget Responsibility will certify the government's costings for these measures at budget, and it will also include the interaction with other VAT receipts. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the contributions in today's debate, I'm going to make some progress. You spoke earlier already. No, indeed. I know many members are concerned about children with SEND. I mean, you can shout as much as you can like, but I've got some really important points to say here about SEND. I know I speak for the country, but the honourable gentleman certainly doesn't, and I can assure them that the Treasury has sought to ensure that these changes do not disadvantage pupils who need provision unavailable in the state sector. Let me be clear. Pupils who need a local authority funded place in a private school, including those with a local authority funded EHCP, will not be affected by the changes. This is because local authorities are able to reclaim VAT when they are charged. For other pupils, this change should not mean that pupils will automatically face a 20% higher fees. The Government expects private schools to take steps to minimise fee increases, including through reclaiming VAT that they incur in supplying education and boarding. I'd also note that the IFS analysis shows that the number of children in private schools has remained steady despite a 20% real terms increase in average private school fees since 2010 and a 55% rise since 2003. Turning to the points raised by members across the House on transfers to the state-funded sector, there are always some pupils moving between private and state-funded school sectors. Approximately 50 maintained private schools close every year for a range of different reasons. Where schools do close, pupils may transfer to another private school or move into the state sector. We simply do not accept, in the case of recent closures, that this has had any connection to our policy on VAT. Quite simply, the evidence does not bear that out. The number of pupils who might switch following these changes represent a very small proportion of overall pupil numbers in the state sector. Any displacement is likely to take place over several years and will lead by parents choosing not to place their children in the private sector to begin with, rather than children leaving the private sector. All children of compulsory school age are entitled to state-funded school place if they need one. Now, I understand that moving schools can be a challenging experience, and local authorities and schools are already supporting these processes to support pupils moving between schools. A number of members have also raised concerns about capacity. There are always a range of pressures on state-funded school places, and the Department for Education works to support local authorities to ensure that every local area has sufficient places for children that need them. This is a business as usual, and local authorities, schools already have a range of options to increase capacity where it is needed. We are confident the state sector will be able to accommodate any additional pupils, that there will be a significant impact on state education as a whole. Madam Deputy Speaker, may I congratulate my honourable friend for North East Derbyshire on her maiden speech, who I know will be a real champion for children and young people in her community. May I also welcome back to his place my honourable friend for Bury North, and congratulate the new member for Glasgow East for his maiden speech, who so eloquently spoke with passion about his constituency and the needs of his constituents. It was a real pleasure to hear the maiden speech from the opposite benches from the member for Isle of Wight East, who described so well his beautiful constituency, a place I enjoyed holidaying in as a child. I look forward to working with him on issues affecting the Solent region. My honourable friend for Tipton and Wednesbury gave an excellent maiden speech, and it was very evident she will be a strong national voice in this place and for her community. I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for Horsham for his maiden speech, and I wish him well on his unexpected new role in this place and to deliver opportunity for all. On military families, with the contributions from the member for South Shropshire and others, I know colleagues in the MOD and FCDO will closely monitor the impact on affected military families, considering their support via the continuity of education allowance schemes. On contributions on small faith schools raised by a few members, I note these schools meet the needs of dedicated faith communities, often at low cost, and I know Treasury colleagues have met with representatives from these schools to ensure fairness. During the debates, a number of members and right honourable members spoke about the impact assessment. As my colleagues, the Exchequer Secretary, have set out in opening, we're considering the impact of these policies and will publish a tax information and impact note at budget in the usual way. So in conclusion...
The Minister is coming to his conclusion.
In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government was elected to deliver change across our country, not least in our schools. Our mission to break down barriers to opportunity is exactly what our country needs. This party is showing that education is once again back at the forefront of national life, and I urge members across this House to demonstrate this by voting against this motion this afternoon.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no.
No! No!
Division. Clear the lobby. Question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Louis French and Mike Wood. The tellers for the noes are Jen Kitchin and Keir Mather.
The ayes to the right, 190. The noes to the left, 363.
The ayes were 190. The noes were 363. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock.